Holiday over. The holiday over in a Rome deaf to all naive expectations, the night falling like trash on the wind, returning footsteps, voices, whistles fading away, far flung in the streets, hollow in the hallways. It's the pause for supper, but where the city's chaos congeals in empty lots and clusters of light, along avenues immured in a deathly peace. It is already ancient light and sunk as in a tranquil tomb. The city chaos freezes. In the mud, the cyclist burns up, lost in his desolate race. A drawn out song resounds over the asphalt, dirty and wet. Then along the riverside, dazzling crowns of headlights, a star or two with the clouds, on the edges of the city, from Monteverde to Testaccio, the wet and weary hum. The wet and weary hum of workers, voices, and motors turns stale. Flimsy crust of our world over the naked universe. That was a book, Roman Poems, by the Italian film director and poet Pier Paolo Pasolini. And the book was translated by Lawrence Ferlinghetti. And it's a pretty small book. And I know poetry is not something that is a lot popular. People would like to believe and say that poetry is not there yet. It was an art of the olden times. But if you look at social media, poetry, there are a lot more poets today than before, I guess. And I think writing poetry, reading poetry, and that too reading loud, it's very important. And about 2 years back, I had done a poetry reading campaign for about 155 days continuous, and the whole idea was to promote poetry among the people that I know. And even when I did the challenge for reading 50 books, some of those books have been poetry books, and one of the books was Roman Poems by Pasolini. I'm going to read a few poems, especially when I'm going to introduce you to poetry books. I am going to read a couple of those poems, and so that you get a sense of this, is also to tell people how you should read poetry. Don't be silent, read it loud. Civil Song. Their cheeks, fresh and tender, and perhaps kissed for the first time, seen from behind, turning their backs to return to their tender group, they seemed older. With their coats over their light pants, their poverty oblivious to the winter cold, legs slightly bowed, and collars frayed like old brothers. Already discredited citizens, for a few years they will still be without prize, and there's nothing can humiliate those who can't judge themselves. Although they do it with such incredible naturalness, they offer themselves to life. And life, in turn, wants them. They are so ready, they return kisses, savoring the novelty, then go off as unperturbed as when they came. But since they're still so full of trust in the life that loves them, they make sincere promises, plan promising futures of embraces and kisses. Who would make the revolution if it ever has to be made, if not them? Tell them they all are ready in the way they embrace and kiss with the same ardor on their cheeks, but it won't be their trust in the world that triumphs, that no doubt the world will ignore. That's a interesting poem. This one is good. The Resistance and Its Light. Thus, I came to the days of the resistance, without knowing anything except style. It was a style all of light, memorable consciousness of sun. It could never fade even for an instant. Even as Europe trembled on the deadliest of eves, we escaped with our household goods in a cart from Cassara to a village lost among canals and vineyards. And it was pure light my brother left on a mute March morning in a clandestine train, his pistol in a book, and it was pure light. He lived long in the mountains which shone almost paradisical in the blue gloom of the Frulian plain. And it was pure light. In the attic of the farmhouse, my mother always watched those mountains, hopelessly, already aware of fate. And it was pure light. With a few peasants around, I lived the glorious life, persecuted by atrocious edicts, and it was pure light. Came the day of death and freedom. The martyred world recognized itself anew in the light. The light was a hope of justice. I didn't know which justice. All light is equal to all other light. Then it changed. The light became uncertain dawn, a growing dawn, spreading over Frulian fields and canals. It illumined the struggling workers. The rising dawn was thus a light beyond the eternity of style. In history, justice was consciousness of a humane division of wealth, and hope took on a new light. That was the resistance and its light. It's important that once in a while you go to your libraries, pick up a poetry book, read it, because there was a time, in the past, not that distant past, when before the digital age, before we had our cell phones to always look at, and before we had TVs and laptops, and always something or the other to be done with our fingers. When two people met, they ask, "So, what are you reading now?" Think to yourself, how many times in the past year have you asked people, have you had a conversation asking what they're reading now? And has anyone asked you, or if someone comes to you and asks, "Hey, what are you reading now?" What's the answer that you're going to give them? If they ask you, what is the series on TV that you're watching, what are you binge watching, you might probably have an answer. But for many people, if they are asked the question what they are reading now, it's a fact that many people will not have an answer. So pick up your book, start reading. Short stories is a great way to read, just like poetry. Every day you can read, before you go to bed, you can read a small short story. And short stories, the whole idea is that there's a big idea that is concised, put into a few words. And then once you read that, those words kind of expand inside you. And it starts talking to you. So it's important that maybe if you're not much of a reader, a collection of short stories would be a good way to start, or poetry. But poetry, never read poetry in silence, because poetry is written so that people are not silent. Poetry is written for those people who are silent, who don't have words. It talks to the world in the voices of those who cannot raise their voices. So when you read poetry, make sure you read it loud. Read it to someone. Read and record it. I'll come with another book. For now, Roman poems. Take care.